everybody. Recording live from somewhere. This is Zach Couples with episode number 89 of the Movement Debrief. And tonight, folks, since this was off the books, it's going to be a surprise right in your eyes. We're going to talk about touching the toes. Do you have the ability to touch your toes? What happens if you touch them too far? What happens if you can't touch them? I'll give you some answers in terms of how to get that mo better and why it's important to do so. We're going to talk about big toe extension. Why is that a big deal? What kind of things can you utilize so you can make that better? And why should you make it mo better? I'll give you the answer. And last but not least, we're going to talk about snoring. Why is it that your sorry self snores? What should you do about it to get it mo better? What is the course of operation so you can improve your sleep? Because snoring is no bueno. But these are questions that have been asked by the people. They'll be answered for the people by this people right here, Fam Recognized Fam. Without further ado, let's debrief, shall we? The first question comes from Chad. And Chad types, what are your thoughts on toe touching or lack thereof? Chad, I will give you my thoughts. Toe touch. Why is this a useful thing to measure? What is it measuring, first off? What I think, and of course I'm biased by many of the things that I learned from Daddy-O Pops Bill Hartman, who I will link in the show notes. But what I think touching toes shows, hey, I rhymed there, how about that? That's how it goes. Album coming out 2020, holla at your boy. I think touching toes is demonstrating the ability to achieve spinal inhalation. What that involves is being able to counternutate the sacrum, reduce the lumbar lordosis, expand the posterior thorax, get some OA extension, and some cervical flexion of the lower cervical style. If you can do that pretty well, you probably will be able to touch your toes. Also, demonstrating that you have movement options available in the hips, that's also a very useful thing. But if you have all those things, you probably got a good shot at touching your toes. That's what it tells me. I utilize the toe touch as a comparator test and also as kind of my terminal thing to demonstrate that someone has the ability to establish what I just said, spinal inhalation. So it is a good marker of movement variance and one's ability to apply the movement options that we've been working on in the clinic in a weight-bearing context. Now, what isn't desirable necessarily is being able to palm the floor. If you see someone who can palm the floor and they fall down like it's no one's business, well then, what you probably have going on is a crazy amount of straight leg raise or hip flexion, and that's how they're accessing the floor without necessarily getting that curve that is desirable when you're touching someone's toes. So you have someone who may not be able to inhale the spine, yet because for whatever reason, there could be several reasons, they have a crazy amount of flexibility at the hips, they can palm the floor, no problem. This is not necessarily a desirable thing. So the question is, how do I improve this? How do I make someone who can't touch their toes touch them, or someone who palms the floor demonstrate that rounded capability that we're desiring, that spinal inhalation? I'm glad you asked. The way we do that is by working on many of the different things that I've been talking about on this debrief. Big things I would emphasize would be, of course, making sure someone can stack the pelvis over the rib cage, exhalation and tuck. So you're doing your infrasternal angle stuff. You're working on posterior tilting. If you don't know what that is, for crying out loud, where you been? I'll link it in the show notes, though, just because I like you, which will be on ZachCouples.com at some point this week. Angle and pelvic tilts. There we go. So once you have that, I also like emphasizing posterior thorax expansion. You can use different activities that are in quadruped. I like a lot of inverted activities to really drive air into the posterior thorax. All of that can be very useful to initiate the toe touch. I'll link some of those exercises as well in the show notes that I like. But let's say you did all that stuff and they look pretty good on the table, but for some odd reason they can't touch their toes. When you get to that point, I really like utilizing toe touch progressions. And I have some different ones that I've been using. A few of them that I've gotten from Bill, a few of them I've, made up on my own with some of the same concepts. I'll link those in the show notes. But basically what you're doing is you are taking advantage of what the joint positions go into inhalation and exhalation, and you're driving those as you go into touching your toes. Some of this is at the feet. Some of this is using some ballistic actions to be able to perform that. But basically mimicking what touching toes looks like. Sit-up variations actually are another great way of restoring someone's toe touch capabilities, which, a little sketchy. But if you're doing these things unweighted, likely low risk, and your spine has to be able to get into those positions in order to touch your toes. And more often than not, if you go along that progression, you'll probably get most people to touch their toes. I'm one personally, struggles with the toe touch from here and now and then. And doing some of these techniques, I can touch my toes very, very quickly within, a few reps of this stuff. So I think that the respiratory component is very useful. I think appreciating that the toe touch is a demonstration of one's ability to put the spine into a particular respiratory orientation. And if you do some of those things that I had discussed, get the infrasternal angle dynamic, be able to tuck your hips, achieve posterior expansion, work toe touch progressions, you ought to be in business. And to add the summary, actually I think that's all I need about that summary, because that's all you need for a toe touch, in my opinion. So thank you, Chad, for a great question. The next question comes from John. John writes, Big Z, hope all is well. I was wondering if it would be possible to discuss great toe extension limitations on an upcoming movement debrief. Can you walk through great toe extension limitations and how either a plantar or dorsiflexed first ray drives your decision making? John's a mentee, so he's a little bit on the up and up. So he knows some of this stuff. So obviously we know what the big toe is. The big toe is your big toe or the great toe. And you should be able to extend the big toe about 70 degrees, I believe. That's normal. If you check big toe extension, you'll find that more often than not, most people can't do that. Now we have to ask ourselves, why is it that these people can't extend their big toes? I'll give you the answer, at least my thought on the answer. Let's assume that you did all the wild and crazy things I just talked about with the pelvis and the thorax, because that's how I would go into working on someone's big toe extension. But let's see how it could be limited by looking at someone's foot. If I have someone who is everted at the calcaneus, so it's tipped inward, what can happen is the first ray, which would be your first metatarsal, will be pushed down into the ground. This would be a dorsiflexed first ray, so it would essentially be pushed upward because you're driving it really hard into the ground. As that happens, and the arch flattens, I develop a eccentric orientation of my foot, and that would include muscles that drive or would allow for or have to eccentrically orient to achieve big toe extension. So then what I have is a passive insufficiency. What that is if I, for example, flex my wrist and I try to go extend it, I may have a harder time doing that than if I do it from a neutral wrist position, whatever the hell that means. Because the tissues are at a mechanical disadvantage because they're eccentrically elongated to be able to perform the action of wrist extension. All right? That's one case in which you could have a big toe extension limitation. You already are at end range, therefore you can't achieve big toe extension. The other case could be if the calcaneus is inverted. Now in this case, what would happen is, in order to ensure that I don't sprain my ankle, I may plantar flex the first ray to create some semblance of an arch. What that's going to do is that's going to concentrically orient the bottom of the foot, which would again, limit big toe extension because the stuff on the bottom of the foot is concentrically active. And then when that happens, you can't move your big toe into extension. Those are two ways one limitation may present. It can either be because the tissues are eccentrically oriented and you can't stretch them any further, or it could be because the tissues are concentrically oriented and they can't let go to allow for the big toe to excurse fully. So what's the fix? Assuming you did all the ventral cavity stuff that you would normally do. The fix would be to take the foot position, particularly the calcaneus position, first and place it into the opposite strategy that is currently being utilized. For example, if I have an everted calcaneus, I'm going to do something to tip it to a neutral position. Calcaneal inversion-based activities, which can be posterior hip stretching, things where you're feeling the lateral aspect of your heel, things driving the adductors, because as I invert the foot, if I keep inverting, my adductor muscles begin to kick on because that is hip adduction. If I have the opposite case where I have an inverted calcaneus, then I want to do things that drive calcaneal eversion. So feeling the arch, feeling the medial heel, driving hip abduction, because as I continue to evert, my hip abducts. I'll give you some of my greatest hits for both of these things. Inversion, eversion. All that being said, once you have a neutral calcaneus position, then what you want to do is not drive big toe extension, but you want to drive ankle dorsiflexion. This is where squatting or even some of the toe touch progressions that I mentioned earlier can be very useful. You want to be able to do that, so now I have full excursion of the ankle joint. Then once you've done that, and you've potentially restored all other movement options that may be limited at the foot, which if you have more often than not adjusted the calcaneus position, you probably have a good restoration of inversion and eversion. Then and only then would I go after big toe extension. More often than not, what I do for that is a manual-based stuff, and it's your classic joint mobs, nips. I do soft tissue stuff. A lot of those things can be very useful to restore big toe extension, and then working on active big toe extension once you have the motion available. But it's really the very last thing, because if you have one of these influences that's more proximal, whether it's inability to dorsiflex the ankle, if the calcaneus is everted or inverted, you need to address those influences first. Otherwise, you might just be getting transient effects in the beginning of the session and then they don't last. So you want to address these other influences that can impact the movement available at the big toe. Now let's say you've done all that, but you have someone who's either got a bunion or they have a rigid big toe that doesn't move. They have hallux rigidus or hallux limitus. What you going to do about that? For those types of people who have bony changes, you're probably not going to be able to do much about their ability to extend the big toe. So what you need to do in that case is, more often than not, damage control. Not that they're damaged, but say they're active people and they're playing sports. This could be where you're partnering with a podiatrist on getting an orthotic that limits big toe extension, or limits the amount of motion that the big toe must undergo as someone is walking. Orthotics are very useful for this. You can also utilize exercises that maybe don't put the big toe into extension. So rear foot elevated split squats are amazing for people who have hallux rigidus. But if you do those things, more often than not, aside from the damage control stuff, if you address calcaneus position, teach the ankle to move in all directions, the big toe will clean up more often than not, which is a big deal because we need that big toe extension anytime we go into terminal hip extension, which on the performance side is sprinting. On the health and wellness side, that could be getting someone to walk more effectively. To summarize, that's when big toe extension is important. It can be limited secondary to anything above the foot. Address that first and foremost. Once you've done that, If the calcaneus is everted or inverted, that can create big toe extension limitations. You'll want to tip them the way that they aren't. Once you've done that, get ankle dorsiflexion. If you still got some limitations, go after the big toe with whatever good stuff you got. If the person has structural abnormalities, do a structural fix, such as using orthotics and choosing activities that don't put the big toe into extension. So, my man, John, amazing question. If you want to know how to apply that stuff to your population that you work with, or maybe you stink at touching your toes and you can't get your clients to touch their toes, and you want to, man, what kind of things can I work on to get people to touch their toes more effectively? Because that's very useful skill to be able to do in the weight room, because if you can't touch your toes, well, that could possibly impact your squatting capabilities, your deadlift capabilities, and other things. Maybe some people who have back pain can't touch their toes because the back muscles are engaged on fuego, and they need to be able to get that stuff to relax in order to get out of pain and get back to living their lives. Well, I can give you an answer in terms of how to do that. And the answer is coming to Human Matrix. And it is coming your way. Folks, tonight, 11:55 p.m., the early bird discount for Cincinnati on August 3rd and 4th is up. So if you haven't signed up yet, I would strongly encourage you to give it a shot. Otherwise, other places that I have Human Matrices. August 24th and 25th in Vancouver. That early bird is also coming up at the end of the month. You better sign up for that ASAP. September 21st and 22nd in Raleigh, North Carolina. October 5th and 6th in Boston, Massachusetts. November 23rd and 24th in New York City. And December 7th and 8th in Orlando, Florida. And I'm also working on one in Northern California that will be in January 25th, 26th. Tickets will be available for that soon. Without further ado, the last question comes from my dude Drew, and he writes, "What's good, Big Z? What course of action would you recommend to a consistent snorer who is often/always tired in the morning, even when getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep? Thanks." All right. I'm glad Drew brought this question to my attention, because anytime you have someone who is getting the right amount of hours of sleep and they're still not feeling rested, we have to do some problem solving through that, because you could have something that's potentially not a good thing. So my initial thought, worst case scenario, is, does this person have sleep apnea or not? I need to get that taken care of ASAP. So my questions would be, and the way I would go about this is, first off, are you doing everything in your power to maximize the sleep environment, sleep hygiene? Are you turning off your electronics a couple hours before bed? Are you keeping the lights dim, which is what I'm not doing right now? Are you using blue blocking stuff? Are you blocking blue light? Are you getting sunlight in the morning? Is your room cold? Do you have all the lights blocked while you're asleep? Do you have pets out of the bed? All of these things would be boxes I would check if you haven't already checked that stuff. Are you not eating too soon before bed? That could be another one to consider. If you're not doing those things, that would probably be the first line of defense. Get your sleep hygiene up to snuff. Do you have a pre-bed routine? Are you off screens? Get that first. If you are doing all that and you still are not getting your sleep the way you should, I would consider doing many of the stuff that I've been talking about on this podcast today in this debrief, but also you probably want to get checked out by someone. I would find either a dentist or an ENT, have them get you a sleep study. See if you have sleep apnea. If you rule that out, that would be amazing. Or you may have a thing that's called upper airway resistance syndrome. Either of those things could potentially be negatively impacting your sleep. If you're not sleeping and you're not getting well rested, that's a problem. That's not just a problem for you performing in the short term, but long term, poor sleep quality could have negative consequences. You want to make sure you get that taken care of. What kind of treatments could be performed? You could have something such as CPAP if you have sleep apnea. Many of the surgeries that I have gotten, whether it's the wisdom teeth extraction, the tongue tie, getting the turbinates reduced, all of that is in an effort to improve the upper airway. And really all of those interventions that a dentist or an ENT might be able to do for you is to improve your upper airway so the airway isn't collapsing while you're sleeping, which could be negatively impacting your sleep quality. So you really want to get that checked out. And I listed a bunch of more aggressive styles of treatment. You can also utilize, aside from a CPAP, there's certain appliances that may be able to bring the jaw forward and down that could open up the airway while you're sleeping, allowing you to get oxygen more effectively, which may help with your sleep quality. There's a lot of different treatments that you can do. It's really outside of my scope to make the call in terms of what each person needs. That's where you really need to partner with a good dentist and ENT in order to make those calls. And even for myself, if I have someone who I think needs that, or me, these are things that I'm looking into for myself, I refer out because it's not in my skill set yet to determine or triage what each individual needs. My go-to guy for this stuff is Joe Cicinelli, who I will link in the show notes because I like Joe. He's been huge for me. So to summarize your great question, Mr. Drew, if you're snoring, the worst case scenario is sleep apnea or upper airway resistance syndrome. Make sure you got your sleep hygiene on fleek. If you've done that, you can certainly keep doing the stuff that I have been preaching about in these debriefs, but you probably want to get yourself checked out by an ENT or a dentist. I would strongly encourage getting a sleep study if you're getting the recommended hours of sleep, and you may need to do some type of intervention with the dentist or the ENT, which could be as innocuous as getting an appliance, could be getting a CPAP, or it could be much more aggressive treatments such as different surgeries. You could be looking into braces. You could be getting a tongue tie, the roto-rooter, as they call it, getting the turbinates reduced. Any of those things could be useful treatments to helping you there, but you really need to get to the professionals to get to the root of the problem. Great question, Drew, and I think that's a good stopping point for us tonight. I want to thank all of you beautiful, sexy, outstanding people for tuning in. I'm going to be taking about a week or so off on these debriefs because I'm going to be in Costa Rica at my boy Ben House's place. I'll link that in the show notes. And I'm pretty excited about that. Don't worry, though. I will be giving you some content to be checking out as I am off on the beach. I want to thank all of you beautiful, sexy, outstanding people for tuning in. If you want to learn more, go to zachcouples.com. I want you to subscribe to my newsletter while you're there. You can sign up for many of my services, and that's really going to be the hub for me. If you want to learn more about this stuff, you can also find more of the debriefs on iTunes or Stitcher. You can also find them on YouTube because, whether you want to look at me or whether you want to listen to me, I don't really care. Just give me a shot, see what we got. Keep it real, but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving, and I'll see you next time. Deuces.